Oh, wow. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, for 2 years actually. In the north.
Yeah. When did you? When were you there?
When did I leave from Princeton?
Or yeah, I guess when? What
Yeah,
year?
2019. I was 2017 to
Oh, okay.
2019.
Okay. Okay.
I
So
went
we
for
overlap.
1 year then
I see.
in Japan, and then
Okay. Yeah, I started at Princeton 2017.
very nice. Yeah, I mean, I know your name. I had seen that in
I see.
Princeton.
I see.
And and I should have seen like publications of of your work and stuff like that.
So also like we should this panel discussion should be like kind of whenever you have a question, I mean you can raise your hand and I can like we can try to moderate it or you can just also like say it. So I guess to start a discussion we have prepared a couple of questions and like one very generic question or like for kind of every one of you is like in what point of your career did you pick up on the importance of risk-sensitive approaches, and how do you feel it has changed the overall direction of your research? And maybe just like, I don't know, everybody could say something about that.
Sure. Yeah, I guess for me it was during kind of right after my PhD. So in my PhD, I worked on robust like control methods, like methods that take into account like worst case uncertainty. So if you have a drone that's subject to wind gusts, that can use somehow do like real time like motion planning while taking into account worst case disturbances. And then in my postdoc work with Marco Pavone, we started thinking about these like risk ideas. He was already thinking about them. And I think for me, it was this kind of realization that it gives you a tuning knob to go from like worst case analysis, which is often very pessimistic, to like just expectation, which is often like too optimistic. And I think that perspective, like that there's a whole spectrum of things in the middle from worst case to expected value, that was kind of a realization that has stuck around with me even in the work we're doing right now.
It was very similar for me as well. I mean, I did my PhD on problems like for joint resource allocation control in wireless communications and stuff like that. Everything was risk neutral, let's say. And then at some point, I stumbled upon some references, publications, on risk-aware optimization, and it felt very intriguing. I mean, to look into it more. I mean, one is for sure, like the mathematics, like it might seem a bit daunting at first. They're not hard, but it's like a different language, like to communicate a more expanded language to communicate than talking about expectations only, at least for engineers, right? And then I went to do a postdoc at Princeton, right, where I worked with very well-known professor Warren Powell in operations research, where actually he gave me the opportunity to look into risk analysis and risk-averse optimization as deeply as I wanted, and and then I started actually publishing this kind of things. Yeah, and then this work that I presented before I was interrupted. I did when I was a postdoc at Penn, right? So I went back to an electrical engineering group, right? And I tried to bring these ideas to problems over there. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, so for me, I did my PhD in a laboratory that focused on aerospace applications. And so most of the work there was robust, like disturbances within bounds. And then I was also kind of around, I did my PhD at Berkeley, and so there was a lot of robot learning there, and Peter Abiel's group, Sergey Levine, and so I was kind of around that space too, and everyone there was doing pretty much expectation. And so I thought, well, what's in the middle? It seems like there's something missing. And I'm also very interested in, I would say, somewhat non-standard applications like environmental systems and cancer treatment systems. And so neither the expectation point of view or the worst case point of view seem to really work for any of those kind of messy, but really important applications. And yeah, and then I just started kind of diving into it. I also worked with Marco Pavoni, who had done some work in the area beforehand, and I started digging into the math in one of his papers and found some challenges. And so that really inspired me to keep kind of exploring it. And the math is beautiful. I love real analysis and I love probability theory, and some of the best books were written in like the 1970s about that. And so my brain just loves that stuff. So like working in risk and probability theory, even though it's not taught, I would say, well at all in engineering classes, but it's just a really beautiful math, and it has really broad applications. So that's kind of what has made me kind of go into it. And so I've been in this for, I guess, since like 2018, so not too long, like 4 years. But I also, then I started diving into the literature, and you see like, oh my gosh, this thing has like a rich history since like 1738, which is when Daniel Bernoulli first talked about utility functions. And so it's kind of a pretty much ignored, area of research because it's not mainstream. And I've always been kind of attracted to those really important research areas that people kind of just shove under the rug until someone decides, oh, this is actually important. So yeah, that's my story.
Great. So, I mean, I did a PhD also in kind of nonlinear control, robust control, with a focus on multi-agent systems and formal methods. So temporal logics, how we can achieve complex system behavior for multi-agent systems. And this was all living kind of in a deterministic world. And when I started my postdoc in 2020, also in the group at Penn, which was inspired by Dionysus, that were thinking about risk, I started thinking about, how do we now define really risk when we have temporal logic specifications involved? Like, what are the right notions to look at temporal logics when uncertainty is in the loop in some way, be it the environment or the control system itself? And since then, I've been thinking mostly about how can we define it, and the next natural step is also how can we control then systems under stochastic systems under temporal logic specifications. And that's also, I guess, what will shape my future research.
Thank you.
So I have maybe a couple of questions to follow up on the stuff you said. The first one is, at least Annie started mentioning it, and then everyone else mentioned it again, is the fact that all these different notions of risk we think about, they give us this freedom of moving somehow on a continuum between the expectation or the average performance and the worst case scenario. And the question is, have you thought, or are you aware of any literature where somebody actually tries to decide where we want to be on the spectrum? Because we always kind of mention the fact that this kind of gives us the freedom of moving between both scenarios, but it remains somehow of an empirical way of deciding this is where I want to be on the spectrum. So yeah, you can highlight a little bit on this.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great question. So I think the closest to an answer that I have is looking at the dual perspective to these risk metrics, which have this distributional kind of robustness formulation. So like CVAR or any coherent risk metric, you can formalize as taking the worst case expectation, worst case over some risk envelope, right? Like some family of distributions. And I think for certain applications, you might have constraints on what that family could be. So maybe you have some training distribution, some test distribution, and so you want to be robust to some family of potential test distributions. If you can bound that set somehow, then that tells you like what the risk metric should be, and then that gives you a nice way to choose kind of where you should be from risk neutral to risk averse. So I think that dual perspective is probably the most kind of direct way that at least I know of or have thought about to choosing this, like where you want to lie on the spectrum. Others have better answers.
No, that's certainly a very good point. Another point is what you want to do, right? I mean, the whole thing with doing risk-averse modeling or risk-averse optimization, right, is you know, there is no particular reason, right, why, and this is actually true, why you would smooth the randomness in a problem using an integral. Okay, and you do that. I mean, if you look in Bertsika's book, like, which is like a very classical standard, like superstar book in controls, I mean, literally he writes, you know, because the cost is random, we use an expectation to make it a number. Okay, so if that doesn't tell you something, right? The point is what? Depending on the problem, I mean, you can do very interesting things with risk measures. You can either look at the tail, right, and say, okay, I want to make my distribution look like a box, right, or something like that. Or you can look at like mean deviation, mean variance type of things, where you know you control stability around the benchmark, right, that you would like to respect. So yeah, and this actually in conjunction, like with the dual representation that very large classes of risk measures have, I mean, give you like how can I say, an extensive pool like of choices, right, on how like to make decisions. Although I have to say, right, that, you know, if you attempt, for instance, to use risk-aware modeling for doing learning, for instance, now we're talking about controls, but, you know, if you have also to specify what you mean by doing that, and this is not standard at all, and this is actually open. Okay, so, you know, if someone wants to work in risk-aware machine learning or something like that, this is completely open. But it's also very difficult to penetrate, right? Because people will ask, why do this? And the answer is a question again. So why do expectation? I mean, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so so I haven't seen anybody try to learn, like if you take if you take CVAR, for example, it has a parameter alpha that represents the fraction of worst cases in the upper tail. Or if you have, say, exponential utility, there's a parameter theta that in some cases represents the mean variance trade-off. I haven't seen anybody try to actually learn or update the value of that parameter using data. But if someone were to work on that, that would be an answer to your question. Like you focus on one risk functional or a particular class where there's a parameter, and then you try to update the value of the parameter based on how certain you are about the model. There is a branch of control theory. I think it's this part of dual control, or called, sorry, a sub branch of that, which is called cautious control, where you basically only take action when you are very certain about your model. And if you're very uncertain, then you don't take any action and you become more and more cautious. So that is also kind of gets at a little bit of the learning aspect, I think, is ideas from cautious control. There are issues with cautious control because oftentimes you don't do anything because you're so uncertain about your model. But I think possibly combining ideas with of cautious control with also looking at particular risk functionals where the parameters actually mean something, and then updating those parameters using data is one example. Also, if you're looking at a physical infrastructure system, your amount of worst case that you're permitted to choose really depends on financial considerations of how much money you can spend on your system. So in an aerospace application, there are all these regulatory rules that say, well, you need to have this failure rate or something. And so in that case, the risk parameter is regulated by an agency that says this is what we tolerate as being safe. So I think the answer is really application dependent, but I think it's important to know what your parameter represents, which is why there are certain risk functionals where the parameter has a meaning that's easier to understand. And then those are the ones that you'd want to focus on if you want to say iteratively improve your estimate of that parameter.
Maybe another aspect, I mean, I guess all of us, we have defined risk over distances, over some form of cost that correlates with the state, right? I mean, that's kind of how we think about it. And that's also how I think about it, about, like I said, spatial or temporal robustness in a way, some measures that have an interpretation. But what I was also thinking about, what would be interesting in is, I mean, kind of going into transforming states into a different domain, like money, for instance, right? I mean, Annie, I mean, you mentioned this in your paper to have as an example, as a monetary cost that you have. If you have bad events, that you map them into another domain, for instance, money could be anything else, where you then really get, like in finance, this kind of interpretation of, you know, this is the worst cost I really have to pay as an insurance company. And I think that's maybe also something to think about, is really putting, I mean, we can certainly put risk on top of states, on top of a quadratic cost, but maybe there are other useful ways or measures, transformations on which we can put risk in the end, right? And get a different interpretation that may be useful, again, depending on the application.
But so maybe ask like the other way around. So what is the reason why, for example, especially in machine learning as well, I think it's mostly kind of we only look at the expected value, kind of the probability distribution away. So do you think it has mostly to do with the fact that it's like the computational complexity, that it is very hard to compute that, especially once you have a lot of parameters? Or do you think it's just there is nobody sees the need for it, or like just what is holding us back basically from like using it more widely?
Yeah, so I think it's definitely tractability. I mean, if you look at optimal control and you say, okay, well, why is it called optimal control in any of those classical contexts? It's because we could solve it. And so if you have an expectation, you can get a dynamic programming recursion on the state space. You can solve it in all sorts of different ways. And ultimately, you know, we're interested in applications and practice. And so we want our algorithms to be computationally tractable. And whenever you make anything more general than an expectation, you're going to have issues. So I think part of the issues with adoption is really the computational tractability aspects. And also, if you try to propose, say, an approximation that's based on a neural network or a linear combination of basis functions, there's no or very limited understanding about the conditions under which that type of approximation is well justified. But in the expected value case, we know that we can, in certain conditions, derive a contraction mapping, which means that our optimal value function can be is justified to approximate that as a linear combination of basis functions. But for risk functionals, that isn't known for the most part. Usually you only get a lower semi-continuous function as your optimal value function. And then in that case, how do you approximate that? Well, you only get like a pointwise you only get a good approximation at a particular state. So I think that the tractability issues are really and the lack of knowledge about well-justified approximations are the really interesting research challenges.
Are you asking about learning, for instance, in particular?
Yeah,
because for learning, I mean, you can probably give, I think, like a more specific, let's say, answer. I don't think, and nowadays the issue can be computational for sure, but you know, when machine learning actually, you know, was developed, like the VC theory and all this type of results, which were not actually even expectation or something, but you know, people looked at the problem from the simplest possible angle, right? Okay, It doesn't mean that, you know, when you go and solve like a learning problem using an expected loss approach, that you're doing something meaningful. And you know, all that, all the discussions, you know, about generalization and so on, you know, we are focused, everybody is focused like in gaps, like of expectations, right? Expectations over, you know, a sample, expectations using a base, you know, like the base error and stuff like that. What I'm trying to say is that, you know, the reason was not computational at that point, because they could not compute anything, like, right? So there should be another reason. And the reason most probably is that I'm going to do the simplest that I can, right? And the simplest is expectation. The point is that no human acts like that. When I'm going to drive to New Haven, I'm not going to ask Google on average how much time I'm going to do in order to go there. I'm going to look at, you know, some form of quantile, right? I mean, you know, if I live now, maybe I'm going to go into traffic, so I don't want to do that. So, you know, everything is kind of, you know, risk aware, like in our type of thinking. So, you know, the next step is this, right? And I'm not the only one who says that. I mean, if you ask people like Alexander Shapiro from Georgia Tech, like very big guys, like in these things, like Andrzej Ruzinski from Rutgers, who are like, have spent all of their lives, you know, on this thing, they will tell you exactly the same thing. That you know, there are so many applications. You know, there are so many open problems that you can approach with risk-aware thinking. Go do it. I mean, they have put the, you know, the basis already, right? In the last like 25 years, right?
No, no, go.
We have a question from the Zoom. So Haruki is asking, I was curious about differences in the term risk sensitivity as discussed in economics or mathematical finance versus in robotics. To be more specific, what do you think are the challenges around risk awareness unique to robotics that may not be so obvious in economics?
Yeah, I guess part of it is just thinking about like what kinds of risk metrics are relevant for robotics applications. So in the finance literature, they're kind of like well justified with this axiomatic approach. So part of what I worked on with Marco was like thinking about like what kinds of axioms might be reasonable in robotics like context to define risk metrics. And I don't feel like we necessarily have an answer like to that question, at least in the sense that there's like general like consensus about what are like good properties that a risk metric must satisfy in robotics applications. And I think this goes back to the previous question also about like how do you choose a risk metric? How does that relate to distributional robustness? Like what's the family of distributions that you're trying to be robust to? And it's pretty application dependent, I think. So it's not clear that maybe there is going to be one like class of risk metrics that we're all going to use, but maybe there's some recipe that tells us, okay, if your problem has these characteristics, maybe you can cook up some risk metric for that particular application and then use that, and that's going to have some meaning and work well.
Building off of your mistake now, I kind of wanted to know how the different problem domains you looked at like influence your perspective on risk and traditional. So keep going with that conversation.
Do you want to?
What was the question?
So it's basically about how different application domains have informed the choice of risk functionals that people use. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, one of the reasons why I got into risk averse control is because I didn't think that the existing paradigms could deal with the richness of applications. So in particular we live in a messy world, you can't predict human behavior. You can't predict, I mean, it's very difficult to predict climate trends and patient to patient variability for different diseases. And in the setting of all that uncertainty, it seemed that the risk aware framework offered the opportunity to deal with the richness of uncertainty that we see in real life. That being said, I've worked primarily in stormwater management applications through my collaboration with Kevin Smith. And in that setting, it's very important for specifications to be interpretable. So you want to know what your risk functional means quantitatively, which suggests the use of risk functionals like CVAR, which have that precise and also intuitive interpretation. But if you're working in other applications, say involving a human, it maybe you don't need CVAR because you can't really quantify a human's behavior anyway, because that's already hard to do. So I think that that definitely the application domain informs the choice of risk functional that you use, but to really understand that, you really have to understand the application domain. So you have to work with people who are specialists in that area to understand what are the specific needs that the application domain has to match your expertise with those needs. So there's like a need finding period where you really kind of get to know the application by, collaborating with somebody who's in that domain. And then from there, then you can try to figure out, okay, which risk functional is more appropriate. But you first have to do that need finding aspect, which is also really fun. So
yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. So nothing really to add.
I guess in terms of some specific applications, so you mentioned modeling humans. So I think that maybe the most classical framework for doing that is prospect theory. So that gives you a specific way of modeling like risk and ambiguity. But it seems a little bit unsatisfying. Like maybe it works from the perspective of modeling humans, but mathematically it seems very unsatisfying, at least to me. So I guess one thing that I'd worked on was exploring like using coherent risk metrics to model humans in a kind of inverse reinforcement learning sense. I think for control and like decision-making problems, something like CVAR makes a lot of sense because of its interpretability. I think for machine learning applications, I'm not sure we have like good risk metrics, like some things that are meaningful. So that's yeah, I think you mentioned this as well, a good open problem to think about.
Well, except your estimator, right?
Well, no.
No,
It's a very good point. The point for machine learning, the point is that we don't really know what we mean. I mean, I mean, I've written some papers on that, but I don't really know what I mean when I say, okay, I'm putting my loss function into a CVAR. Again, I'm doing like I'm trying to approximate some form of robust learning. Okay, so what is robust learning? So the point is, there is, this literature or adversarial, learning, for example, and stuff like that, where you have this min Emax type of problems. But, in a more general framework, we don't really know what we mean, right? And most importantly, theoretically, I mean, if you want to define generalization in that framework, you don't know anything. Because, no one has put together like concentration bounds, and statistics, for risk, evaluations of losses with risk measures and so on. These are all open, someone will do it eventually, but, these are all open. Right?
Isn't the problem in learning and control really similar in the sense that you were talking about the loss function, right? I mean, it again depends on the application in the end, right? Like in control, what is your control objective? And you kind of want to wrap the risk around that. So, I mean, it's the same issue in the end, right? That you have.
I'm gonna, since we this is a panel, right? So this is what I believed also in the beginning, but you know, when I was first thinking of those things, okay, I can go and put the risk on everywhere. And now, you know, I'm going to write like 100 papers. Very good. You know, something like that. But it's not so easy, right? Because, you know, in controls are decision-making problems, right? So, you know, you want to, I don't know, regulate the state, you know, by doing something, by cranking a knob, you know, and protecting it from something. Now in learning, the objective is kind of different conceptually, right? You want to learn examples. And when you put you know, like a risk in the problem, it's like saying you want to learn difficult examples. Okay, what are difficult examples? Examples that do not appear often. You know, you have to be very specific about that, right? So it's kind of different.
But I mean, in the end, like, I guess if you're having a control problem, you still put the risk around a cumulative cost, right? Yeah. Over the trajectory in a way, right? While, I mean, in supervised learning, you have a loss on, you know, your observation. I mean, input output basically, or estimate, right? So.
But what about reinforcement learning? I mean, what is that like?
Reinforcement learning is like data-driven control.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
if you, in that case, of course, it matters.
And I think that would probably benefit a lot, right, from.
Yeah, absolutely. Reinforcement learning is another type of problems. Yeah, right. I mean, you know, you want to.
But yeah, I guess it also depends on like what kind of like reinforcement learning. So if you're doing reinforcement learning to like generalize to new like environments, like if you're doing it for like manipulation, for instance, you want to say something about, okay, I use this R algorithm using a training set which only had like mugs, and then now I want to test on balls. Like, what's that distribution shift, right? Like, how do we capture that using a risk metric? I think in those kinds of like deep RL applications, it's a little bit different from control, where I think things are a little bit more physically interpretable in like the model-based control settings that we typically look at.
But so from what I'm gathering, like you think that, so, you know, because generalization and reinforcement learning is like a big problem, right? So from what I'm understanding, you really think that making these problems like risk aware will help with the generalization.
Yeah, I think in some sense those are like, you could say that those are the same thing. Like there's some risk metric that captures the kind of generalization you would want. But the question,
what do you mean generalization? I mean, do you mean the gap? Do you mean the gap between like the expected, I don't know, expected cost and an average? I mean, and an average. You know, this is what I'm trying to say, that, you know, when you say, okay, generalizes, what do you mean by that?
I mean, I think, for example, like generalizing from one task to another one, you know,
okay.
Yeah.
So that's, yeah, that may be right.
So, you know, Ani was presenting the neural network with the distribution over the weights, right? Like you could think that this can actually help with a lot of things. It could, for example, also help with exploration. It could also help with like learning something that generalizes better because you're learning the distribution. It's just very hard to do it usually because it needs so much compute. So, but I don't know. I think probably can put more effort into it.
Yeah, I think we have to put more effort in order to make things concrete. I mean, what do we mean by?
Yeah, so another tool for generalization, which works when you're looking at very rare events, is extreme value theory, which is originally from statistics. So it's not really traditionally in machine learning or in control theory, but that it is designed to generalize beyond the data under appropriate statistical assumptions. And I don't think that's really been used at all in machine learning. It's mostly been used for climate science and like hydrology and earthquake prediction. So again, I think that kind of a theme that keeps coming back is this idea of really kind of having a broad view of what other tools from different domains can be borrowed and then applied to interesting problems in autonomous systems. And so extreme value theory is one example. I learned about that like 7 months ago. So there's probably other ones that are kind of hidden tools in the math department or in the statistics department that are, you know, someone has been developing for a very long time. And then one of us needs to go walk on, you know, knock on the door and say, hey, what are you working on? and then bring it over to autonomous systems. And I think that that's when you get some really interesting novel ideas by looking at those intersections.
Okay, I have a question. So human movement is difficult to predict, but even if we could, but it's perhaps best described as like distribution over a set of different. And basically, my question was, if someone asked you, I thought about how and also like for humans, the notion of risk has a component. And I was wondering if you thought about how an integrated risk
Okay, I guess that's me. So, I mean, I've been thinking about this more recently, and the way I've been approaching this, and this also relates to what you were saying, like going into like the math department, like picking tools and using them, right? And I mean, what is commonly used in order to predict motion, at least short term, are LSTMs, RNNs, like recurrent neural networks. And the thing with those is they give you a point prediction. You can now go to the statistics department and you can use tools that they have derived, which, for instance, are conformal inference, conformal predictions. What these will give you is, along with a point estimate, you will get prediction intervals, like balls, basically, in which your human will be if it acts according to a certain distribution from which you have data, let's say. And you can even do this out of distribution. And that's kind of how I've been thinking. I haven't used any risk functionals there, but for me, risk, when I think about humans, is basically balls, right? I mean, I have a point prediction. What is the probability that they will be within this ball? And how can I do control on top of that if I have a system?
Yeah, maybe just to add on a little bit on that. So I think when we're making like human like motion like predictions, like pedestrian like trajectory prediction, one I think really hard problem is the fact that like the motion that a pedestrian has depends on like what the robot does. So even if you may go beyond like a point prediction to a distribution, the distribution you predict actually depends on what the robot is going to do. And typically the way like people apply like machine learning to like pedestrian trajectory prediction is you just collect some large like data set. Like Waymo has like an open data set where their like cars drove around in many cities, collected lots and lots of data of what the other agents were doing. But it's not necessarily the case that you can, if you learn from that data set, you can deploy your own autonomous robot, because that robot might employ a different policy, which could then change the actual like motion that other agents make. I'm not sure if that's like captured by some like neat risk metric, but it's at least a distribution shift like problem that I think is a pretty like kind of a challenging one.
Yeah, that's a really good point. One other thing I wanted to mention is in respect to having multiple agents involved, like humans, is that we may have different risk levels with respect to different participants, for instance, in traffic, right? Or if we have autonomous robots, we may want to have a higher risk level with respect to a human than with respect to another robot. And I think there's also something interesting to think about. How do we, think about risk when we have several specifications and we want to assign several different risk levels to these specifications, right? I mean, just this example of a human and another robot, obviously we would have different risk preferences as our own robot with respect to that.
My questions are related to me say when I think about my cars, like countless factors that sort of relate to whether I feel particularly risk or risk, raining or not raining, or I was just
there any sense of, right, I think we talked about this for now, like factors in the environment that could like inform us on for which way the knowledges are. You're saying on track, right? Application, you know, you're more so
I mean, I guess that relates a bit to your work with out of distribution data. So I guess when you can detect that you are out of distribution, you may want to tune the risk level a bit more to the right, but maybe.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. The other application I was thinking about was in like autonomous vehicles. So if you observe that a different driver, like a human driver, is risk averse, then maybe your robot can like take advantage of it and be more risk seeking in a sense and kind of like overpower aggressively the risk averse human. Or if you see the opposite, if you see someone driving very aggressively, then maybe you want to be more risk averse and act conservatively. But of course, that involves like figuring out the risk, like sensitivity of other agents in the environment.
So just a follow-up point, you can look at that in a game theoretic framework, like for like a Nash equilibrium. You can, let's say you have a multi-agent system and you're trying to, like, you want to say equalize the risk in some way where every agent has a different parameter. So that could be one way. I haven't worked on that, but that's one idea. And I think that this also goes back to the point of how do you update your parameter? So if you start with one particular risk functional with one parameter, how do you update that iteratively over time appropriately? And a natural place to start for that is to take ideas again from cautious control, which is based on how certain you are about your model. And then you're basically more and more risk averse when you become less and less certain. But that's not a new idea. That comes from like a long time ago. But that's a place to start, I think, at least when we're talking about applications that involve the humans and robots or other multi-agent systems.
Okay, so I mean, unless there is any other question from the audience, I think it's already late. So maybe we can conclude like with a final question about what would you be the most excited about to see in this field of that kind of risk awareness in the next 5 years?
Who wants to go first?
Whoever wants to go first.
Okay, I need a moment to think.
Yeah, I think for me, like going back to this question of like what risk metrics should we use, like what are meaningful risk metrics in robotics or specifically like learning, like enabled robotic systems. I don't think we really have like meaningful risk metrics for those kinds of applications. So if someone had like a clean set of axioms that applied to those kinds of applications, that'd be really interesting.
You know, leaving like the technical stuff aside, I'd really like to think to see like more people actually, you know, getting into this and think about the problems in this way, and you know, try to contribute like in this effort and literature. So you know, there has been like tremendous amount of work from the finance and OR community for the last like 25, 30 years on that. And, you know, in engineering, computer science, you know, there are very few people that actually, you know, do this kind of work. Very, very few, like 10 or 15. So, you know, this is what I think I would like to see more, like, you know, more people getting into it and, you know, try to make sense of what we're trying to make sense. Right?
So a couple of things I'm really excited about are data sparse applications. There are a lot of really interesting problem domains where it's really hard to collect data. And I think that we need more mathematical tools that can deal with those situations, especially in a context where harmful outcomes are very important to quantify and to provide protection against. The other aspect I'm very excited about is using risk functionals as wrappers around approximations. So one tool that we use to scale up are value function approximations, neural network approximations, et cetera. But risk functionals help actually provide some protection against errors. And so you can imagine taking a risk functional to literally wrap around that approximation so that you can have some desirable properties for quality of approximation guarantees. So that's a second point. And then the third is I'm really hoping that more people will dive in to applications and go beyond, say, what their advisor is doing or what they see other people doing, and to try to really get to know a different application and then try to match their expertise with the needs of that application. And then I think if more people do that, we're going to see a lot of really innovative solutions to some really pressing problems that we're facing today.
Yeah, I agree with these statements. I would like to see applications where, you can really see the difference on a real robot that, here's what happens if you optimize with respect to chance constraints, so probability greater than something. And here's what happens if you use a risk measure, right? And really showing not only what we see in simulations, but really on real robots, this makes a difference, right? If you pick the right risk measure there, you will be more safe, whatever more safe means in that particular application. For me personally, what I would like to see and what I want to do is with respect to, humans, for instance, where we have predictors of human motion and how we can integrate this with guarantees into a control loop in a risk-aware setting. So this is kind of what I'm interested in currently, what I want to go to. And of course, also to further pursue the temporal logics domain. It just seems really difficult to do control when you have complex specifications, the complexity of risk measures. So I think there one really has to use some engineering tricks to make it work, some approximations.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.